Next up, we've got Eric Woodruff, Senior Security Researcher at Semperis, and today Eric's going to explore and speak about a novel discovery that resulted in Privesk to global admin in Azure AD. The title of his talk is UnOauthorized. I see what you did there. Discovering the path to privileged elevation to global administrator. Please welcome Eric.
All right. Thank you. And you might say this is a foreshadowing in some parts of this. So talk probably will run right up to the end. So if there's any questions afterwards, you can sort of find me out there. And we'll just jump right into it. Again, that is me. I have a blue background, so Eric on identity, it's easy to remember. It's boring from like a sort of hackery perspective, but feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And right, as far as the name goes, right, so if we have unauthorized and OAuth 2.0, right, the sort of modern standard out there for authorization and all sorts of cloud stuff, right, you end up with unauthorized, and neither marketing nor AI help with the name. Right, so as far as the background here, there's been a lot of research on service principals, app registrations and applications, and all their integrations right in Azure AD, Entra ID. So some aspects of this aren't really novel in the sense that I was following a lot of similar paths that others have, but there's a twist on it here, right? And ultimately this research area in general, I would just say there's still probably a lot to be explored, right? After the whole Midnight Blizzard thing with Microsoft, and in general, a lot of enterprises, defenders, IT pros don't really understand all the sort of nuances around service principles, right? So it's kind of a nice area for exploration and finding interesting stuff, right? Because ultimately, if you want to sort of own, right, cloud ecosystems, as we may or may not know, right, global admin is sort of the thing, or global admin equivalent is what we're looking to sort of grab out there in Azure AD and Entra ID. So we're going to just sort of level set some knowledge here, because there's a lot of sort of moving parts and aspects to this, especially if you're not super familiar with service principals and app registrations and whatnot in Entra. So first off, just want to talk about the application administrator role. So if we have Entra ID, right, and we have this role, app administrator or cloud application administrator, they're both in scope for the finding, but sort of to keep things short, just going to refer to both as application administrator in the talk here, right? And so we assign that role to a user, and the role generally is used for the life cycle of applications tied to Entra. Right, so that's going to be, whether it's multi-cloud or your SaaS applications, OpenID, Connect, XAML, all that sort of stuff, right, your app admin manages. But if you think of roles as basically swim lanes, or you're driving on the highway and you have solid lines, right, you're basically supposed to stick within that swim lane. So if an app administrator was to say go manage roles, right, in like a greenfield Entra tenant, they're going to get blocked. And again, if you're familiar with this, right, you may know that there's lots of ways for organizations to shoot themselves in the foot, essentially, and set up paths for priv escalation. But in a greenfield tenant, right, this shouldn't be possible. And also, speaking of applications, right, if you've been around the block, you're probably familiar with, services control panel. And right, this is really like, there's a lot of things within Windows that keep it mostly running as long as these services are running. And from a consumer perspective, we don't really care about these things. Right, and the cloud is very similar, right? There's going to be some services and service principals and applications that we may, know, like Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, Azure Portal, all that sort of stuff. But there's actually hundreds and hundreds of others out there, right? And again, blue folks, IT pros, whatnot, don't really need to know or care about this stuff. Just it's stuff Microsoft provides, right, to kind of keep cloud ecosystem and the state for the enterprise afloat. So, jumping into this a bit deeper and talking about applications, in particular multi-tenant applications here, right? And just going to look at how multi-tenant applications work. And again, this is sort of critical to understand the discovery here, right? So pretend I'm a software developer, right? And I have my publisher tenant, and then I also have an app registration that I create, right? And so an app registration as a developer is me essentially defining all the things I need for my application to function in my publisher tenant, right? So I'm going to give it some name, And there's going to be some other characteristics I assigned, or attributes I should say, to it. I'm also going to give it permissions, right? So here I have user read write all, directory read write all, and group read all. And effectively I'm saying as a dev, right, this is the stuff for whatever my application is, needs to function for whoever's going to consume it. Right, so we assign those permissions, and then we grant credentials to it. These can either be a secret, which is effectively a password, or a certificate, right, asymmetric key pair. So I define this in Entra, right, and then effectively I go publish my app, or I go build my application, and it doesn't matter where it's running, it's not really sort of relevant here, right, but I take that application, whether it's running Azure, AWS, Kubernetes, PaaS, right, doesn't really matter. But there's going to be a relationship between the application and the app registration, because effectively I give it the client ID and the tenant ID and the credential, right? And now that application can authenticate to Entra. But I need customers, right? So customer comes along with the customer tenant, and sort of high level here, right? A global admin generally comes in and they perform a flow called an admin consent or an admin consent grant, where effectively the global admin is saying, hey, it's cool, right? We want and need to use this application, so we're going to onboard it into our tenant. And when this happens, a service principal is created, right? And the service principal is a security principal within Entra or Azure AD, where that you can assign permissions and roles to. Like users are also security principals, right? If you're more familiar in that area, right? And so again, this is going to have this tie to the app registration, where it's going to have the name, and more importantly, the permissions, right, that the developer sort of said are needed. Right, so we ultimately end up with this relationship, and again, if I had 100 customers, they'd have 100 service principals to that one app registration. But I need my application to still be able to do stuff, right? So then Graph API, again, is generally the way that, right, Microsoft would recommend that you interact with Entra ID these days, right? So my application is actually going to use the credentials that I assigned to it, authenticate to the customer's tenant. It's going to get an access token back, right? And we pass that access token for authorization along to Graph, and as long as Graph's cool with it, right, we're going to be able to do stuff, and again, the stuff is whatever the app developer has defined here. So Microsoft applications, right, they function very similar. Sometimes you have to infer things, right, because we can't see sort of behind the covers, right, or behind the blinds, and how Microsoft, builds things. But there is a Microsoft tenant, right? They have their own Entra tenant. They have app registrations for Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and all Microsoft customers have service principals for all these, right? And again, so there's that relationship, and here in the example, we have device registration service, right? And again, it has the client ID, Microsoft's tenant ID, and some credentials here, right? And if in theory, right, Graph, or in theory, if device registration services wanted to do things against Graph API, right, it can authenticate to the customer's tenant with those credentials, right, get an access token back, and sort of same flow, right, it's authorized to go do whatever Graph stuff, again, that it is supposed to be allowed to do. But note that there are other APIs out there as well that Microsoft uses. It's not just Graph, right? So bringing this into the research, basically I was curious to impersonate Microsoft applications, but really what I want to do is act as Microsoft service principals for multi-tenant applications, right? And that's like a mouthful, but essentially, like, right, impersonate the applications, borrow their identity, right? From a Entra perspective, I want Entra to think I'm the Microsoft application that's doing whatever it is I'm hoping to do within Graph, right? So if we want to impersonate a Microsoft application, again, right, there's this relationship here. And again, this isn't like unique in that others have written about this stuff and researched this in the past, this piece of things. But what I still think is interesting is that within service principals on the customer tenant, we can assign a credential to this, right? So the app developer knows their credential. Well, we can also assign credentials onto the service principal, right? And once we have that credential assigned to the service principal, because we know it, right, we can have some impersonating application, and in this case, as we'll see, I was just using PowerShell, right, where we can essentially give it that client ID, our tenant ID, and the credential, right, and now we have Graph, we authenticate with our service principal credentials, get our access token back, and we're off, right, into Graph doing whatever the stuff is that we're looking to do. And in particular, right, this is using an OAuth 2 client credential grant flow, which I sort of shorthand to CCGF in a few of the slides, just because, like, you know, it's a mouthful here, right? But effectively, we're kind of almost like authenticating the same way a user would with like a username and password right to Graph here. And just, you know, walking through a few nuances with the flow here, but sort of abstracting it away from Entra again, right? That effectively, if we're performing an OAuth 2 client credential grant flow, right, the application is going to request an access token from Entra ID with the client ID and the secret or credential, right? Entra returns that access token. The application sends that access token off to Graph, right? And if the access token is valid again, we're going to get whatever data back that we requested from Graph, right? And it's an API, so if we're reading data, it's a GET, right? If we're trying to put data, it's a POST, or update data, it's usually a patch operation out there. And a few notes on this. So right in a client credential grant flow, the .default scope is the only scope permitted by Microsoft Graph. And you may, I bring this up because you may see other research where, right, people try to influence the scopes available, but within a client credential grant flow, you have no way to sort of change the scope, right? And you may say, well, what the hell is a scope? And the scope is the application permissions, right? So within OAuth, scopes are how they define the term for permissions, right? So if you see scope, permission, it's all sort of interchangeable. And this is also foreshadowing, the default scope does not indicate additional permissions provided by other authorization systems. Right, so, you know, we kind of have our theory here, and then we're trying to find applications to impersonate. And again, you know, some pretty, I'd say, crappy PowerShell code here, where I'm just getting all the service principals in the tenant. And then after I get all the service principals in my tenant, and actually I add a little box here to highlight this, but apparently it's fallen off my slide. We're actually searching by the Microsoft tenant ID, right? So this is an attribute that's stamped on every service principal. So it's relatively easy for any organization to go see all the applications in their tenant, or the service principals, I should say, that are from Microsoft. So then we just take them, dump them into a for each, right? Create a cred object here where we're just adding a password credential to a service principal, and then very poorly just outputting it into a CSV. We don't have a way of setting what we want the password or secret here, so, you know, just capturing it to reuse this stuff, and then just kind of moving on here. Oh, there it is. It's a little late to the show, but right, and as I mentioned earlier, so it may be hard to see here, but in this one tenant I was using, I have 573 service principals from Microsoft in a tenant that's a couple years old that has Azure and Microsoft 365 and all this sort of stuff, right? I've seen tenants with more, I've seen tenants with less, but right back to the point that there's a lot of service principals and things sort of running out there doing all sorts of stuff, right, to keep that Microsoft ecosystem afloat. But so again, back to some poor code here where I'm just taking all the service principals, another for each, and essentially just stuffing it into a PowerShell cred object here, and just connect to Microsoft Graph, and then running this command get ng context, which effectively will show you what permissions you're supposed to have and some other details. And again, we'll take a look at that in a second. And again, I was just piping it out to a text file just so I could sort of further look at the output of this. Wow, my animations are really messed up there today. So, because that tenant ID that we're using is the customer tenant, or my tenant. It is not the Microsoft tenant in this case. All right. So as far as the applications, right, there was 573 out there, but actually only found 9 applications that actually support the OAuth 2 client credential grant flow. And again, if you're familiar with some of this research, if you go back 3-4 years, this list was like hundreds longer, and Microsoft sort of whittled it down. And right when I reported the case to them initially, there were still these 9 that supported the OAuth 2 client credential grant flow. But still, you know, this in itself, it's like, well, who cares, right? You can connect, right? And I, in particular, was interested in write scopes, right? Being able to have permissions to do things within the tenant, try to move laterally, priv escalation, gain persistence, things like that. And so amongst these, right, I found some did have some write scopes available, but if you really look at the details that are documented anyways about these permissions or scopes, there's nothing actually too interesting, even if some of the names look juicy. If you actually look at what, you know, is documented and what they're supposed to be able to provide, it's not a whole lot. Rights management services had a read scope available, but no write scopes. Right, and then there were 4 applications or service principals that had no scopes whatsoever, right? So effectively these bottom four, if I tried to do anything I expected to get a 403 unauthorized, effectively return back from graph. And this is again like this list in, looking at other research and talking with other researchers, like this list is kind of not unique in that a lot of people had it, but they all kind of were like, oh, well, there's nothing really good here. But it's where, I decided to basically try privileged things anyways. So, right, as far as the tests go, we basically have, I was looking to disable regular privilege user, change a user, privilege user's password, manage role assignments, create a user, delete a privilege user, permanently delete a privilege user, group eligible role assignments, managing those, creating an administrative unit, and managing role assigned group membership, right? And again, I have a mostly blue sort of background. So trying to think of all the ways, right, that organizations manage privilege or that you can gain privilege within Entra, right, basically sort of through this smattering at all these 9 service principles, right? And so the results, so obviously this probably wouldn't have been accepted as a talk if I was like, if nothing was found, right? And again, you could probably sort of guess from the name that found a few things, including, if we go back to this sort of diagram here for the application administrator role, right, where we don't have the ability to manage role assignments. Well, if we actually take device registration service, again, which had no scope, so it should have no permission to do anything, right, we sort of go out and we add a credential, right, a secret, password, whatnot to it. Again, just hop out to PowerShell with that client ID, the credential, our tenant ID, right, and found that we could actually manage roles in Entra, including any role out there, but the focus was primarily on global admin. So, just walking through. So unfortunately, this is kind of another walkthrough of the research, but like Microsoft, I was hoping to record a nice, pretty video of it, but they fixed it before I could actually get that. So all I'm left with are some crappy screenshots here, but effectively, here we go. So, right, again, just going to walk through things here. So we're assigning, right, those credentials to our service principal here, right? We're stuffing them into a PowerShell credential object, and after this, we're connecting the graph, right? And this is where we run that get mg context, and we can see connected as device registration service. So if we went and looked at, audit logs, sign-in logs, stuff like that in Entra, right, it would think we're a device registration service. And in particular, this is where we see that we have no scopes, right? So we shouldn't be able to do anything. But I did find we had some read access here. So, I was running get mg directory role, right, to just get all the directory roles available to me. And again, with the focus on global admin, and also able to look up the directory role members here, right? So we can see right now that there's basically 2 of me as the 2 global admins in this sort of test tenant here. So kind of moving on, then I was like, well, let me find a target user, right? Because I have some read access. Let's see what else we have. So, Megan Bowen here, again, is sort of the target user. So run get mg user, right? Basically to just get her object ID. And then we're just splatting it into an array here where we're effectively taking the global admin role definition ID, taking her object ID, and the directory scope ID, which has to be the root because you can't assign global admin to an administrative unit. And then we run another mouthful, new mg role management directory role assignment with that array as the parameters. Right, and surprisingly, we don't get a 403 response. We actually get a real result back. And at first I thought, well, maybe this test tenant I have is like a dumpster fire. So ran through this in 4 or 5 other tenants just to sort of, reproduce this work, and was finding each time that this worked, right? And again, I'd run get mg context and still see that I'm operating as device registration service and still had no scopes available. And also found that you could actually, well, actually here we're showing, right, that now Megan is also a global admin, right? And similarly could also remove role assignments, right? So now I remove one of my other, Eric Woodruff global admins here, right? And I get directory role members, and again, it's just down to one of me and Megan now. And interestingly found that you can actually, get rid of all the global admins at a tenant if you have role management permissions assigned to an application. It is not specific to this finding, but was also kind of interesting in the way that you could have used this to evict all GAs in the tenant, right? And then again, we go look at our Entra logs, and just another way to sort of verify things, right? Finding that it had member to role, right, was successful, for global admin coming from device registration service. So as far as the findings go, right, this was really the juiciest thing, but also found that Viva Engage, or formerly known as Yammer for the two people that used it, right, that it's delete and permanently delete privileged users were available to Yammer, and rights management services had the ability to create users in the tenant. So, right, this was all reported to Microsoft back at the beginning of 2024, and their response around this was basically, right, so device registration service, they classified it as an important severity for privilege elevation, and this was resolved back in around the March timeframe of things. Viva Engage, Yammer, they marked as medium severity, and again, this is resolved, and rights management services flagged as low severity. I mean, with these, I did argue to them that, right, if you were to look at the principles of authorization, having the ability to do anything that is not defined right within your permissions or roles, to me, is still privilege elevation or some sort of bypass. But right, the most important thing here is that these things were resolved. But of course, I asked them, right, well, like, why did this work, right? Like, I had no scope, so sort of what was going on. Right, and there's some stuff that they wouldn't really reveal, and they're keeping close to their chest about it. But effectively, what they ended up telling me, right, is that you have your Microsoft applications, you have Graph that's accessing these applications sort of from the front end, right? And you have Entra ID on the back, and there's effectively multiple authorization systems. And right, as an external application developer, OAuth scopes, putting aside roles in Entra, are sort of absolute, right? They're like the thing you have to believe. They're like yes or no sort of scenario, right? Where whatever those scopes are what you believe. But Microsoft has other authorization systems in play. They wouldn't really talk too much about what those things were, but effectively they're saying, right, so even though I didn't have a scope to allow these things like role management, that there's some other authorization system in there that basically permitted these things. And right, so if we go back to this app that supported the OAuth 2 client credential grant flow, if you were to go sort of take this work and try to reproduce it, you're actually going to find that this list is sort of no longer valid. They've continued to whittle this stuff down further, right? And so actually now, if you try to go connect to, Graph as device registration service, you get this sort of cryptic error message about the secret being incorrect or like in the wrong field. But effectively, this is their way of using something that is similar to a function called app instance property lock, where they're blocking your ability to get an access token. Again, I sort of tried to press them to like find out like, well, does device registration service have some like need to manage roles? But so far haven't really been able to get an answer from them. So, right, it's kind of like, to me, the lock on the safe in the house is broken, and instead they went and changed the lock on the front door, and they told you it's all fixed, right? You don't really know what's going on under the covers. So from a defense perspective, though, I found this concerning, primarily because things like device registration service has been around for, it's got to be going on a decade plus, right? It's a thing that bootstraps devices into Azure AD, Entra ID. And when I was having conversation with Microsoft, they didn't really refute me sort of putting out there the thought that this sort of finding existed for as long as device registration service has, right? And so again, the other sort of thing that I find troubling is coming from that sort of enterprise side, blue team sort of thing, is that for a lot of organizations, they don't really treat the app administrator or cloud app administrators as tier 0, right? Despite telling organizations they treat it as like tier 0.5 or tier 1 or whatnot. So, in my mind, you have threat actor come along, right? It's much easier to breach, right? That app admin, sort of run through this whole scenario with that user and move on, right? And you'll probably guess, right? Once you have something like global admin, there's like a million different things you can do out there to install persistence. And just working with a lot of enterprises, I would suspect that if someone elevated privilege, even to just temporarily install persistence and go remove themselves, right? Because you might argue, well, it'd be pretty obvious to just leave yourself in there as a global admin. I still think most enterprises would not really be able to easily detect this just because their security is not mature enough, right? So there are a few things we can do from a defense perspective though, right? So we can look for suspicious credentials. Now, again, these aren't absolutes because we don't know, right, if someone ever used this thing, if they also cleaned up after themselves, right? But we can get the service principal for device registration service, and the client ID is globally unique, right? So anyone and any tenant can go look for this. Maybe not like gov tenants. There's probably a different client ID there, right? But we can look for this and look for any certificates. And again, run the same command, essentially looking for any password credentials, right, assigned to device registration service. Similar, right, with KQL or whatever your favorite flavor of SIEM is, SIEM or SIM. You can go do similar, where we can both look for credentials assigned to device registration service, and also if we have logs, right, we can go and look for suspicious actions like role management by device registration service, because there would be no valid reason for device registration service to ever manage roles out there in Entra. And this part is a lot, and it's kind of cruising through this just because there's a lot of content and short a bit of time here. So there is a blog available. I do own Entra.ms, and it's for sale to Microsoft if they've got enough money. But yeah, that is it. I guess actually, if there are any questions, I suppose we got a few minutes to take with you. But otherwise, thank you.